I never expected a simple weekend getaway to turn into something I couldn't explain. It started with the hum of my old Volkswagen, a '79 Westphalia that had been with me through every backroad adventure since college. I had packed it carefully: sleeping bag, a small propane stove, canned beans, a thermos for coffee, and left the city just as the last gold of the sun spilled over the horizon. The plan was simple: escape the noise, drive north, find a quiet campground, and disappear for 2 nights. I didn't know then that sometimes the road isn't just a path. It's a kind of living thing with its own patience, its own hunger. I first noticed it just after the mile marker 73. I was following a stretch of highway that cut through dense forest, the trees so close that sunlight barely reached the asphalt. I passed a few cars going the other way, but eventually I was alone. The radio had gone static on me, the kind of white noise that burrows into your chest. I told myself it was normal, just a quirk of old wiring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. The forest seemed to lean in closer with every mile, shadows stretching longer than they should, the branches twisting like fingers trying to snag the roof of my van. I pulled off the road at what I thought was an official campsite. The sign was weathered, almost unreadable, and the gravel lot looked untouched for weeks. A wooden post with a rusted map leaned sideways, and I squinted at it, trying to make sense of the loops and trails. Everything smelled like wet pine and moss, the kind of dampness that sticks to your clothes and skin. I parked my van, but even as I turned off the engine, the hair on my arms prickled. Something about the quiet here wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. I unpacked quickly, telling myself it was nerves, the kind of tension that comes from city dwellers pretending they can handle the wilderness. I set up my small camp stove, boiled water for coffee, and listened. At first, it was only the usual sounds: wind in the branches, birds calling, the occasional rustle of some small animal. Then came the knocks. Faint at first, like someone tapping on wood in a distant cabin, but my campsite was isolated. I paused, hand on the van door, staring into the shadowed tree line. A voice inside me whispered not to ignore it, but I laughed nervously and chalked it up to the wind, to imagination. Night settled fast. The sky was a heavy, bruised purple, and the stars were faint behind a curtain of clouds. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag in the van, but the knocks didn't stop. They became deliberate, rhythmic, almost like footsteps circling the van. I told myself it was a raccoon, a deer, or maybe another camper, but the rhythm was too intentional, too patient. My pulse quickened. I gripped the steering wheel, eyes scanning the trees, imagining shapes moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight. When I finally looked back at the dashboard clock, it was 10:15, though the sun had set maybe 40 minutes ago. Time seemed wrong here, stretched and thick. Sleep came in fits, punctuated by the occasional tapping that never drew closer but never went away either. I dreamt of the road, endless and unchanging, mile markers climbing past 73, 74, 75, and the forest never letting up. In the dream, I couldn't stop driving. The van rolled on, tires gripping asphalt that seemed to melt into shadows, and I felt my heartbeat hammering against the van walls, loud enough to echo. I woke with a start, cold sweat sticking to my neck, and the first light of dawn was just brushing the horizon. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't. I noticed then that I had parked in the wrong direction. The van faced deeper into the forest, away from the road, as if the campsite had repositioned itself while I slept. By morning, the sun revealed the forest in a false, cheerful light. Birds chirped, and the air smelled less like moss and more like smoke, faint, curling through the pines. I decided to explore the area, to stretch my legs and shake the unease. The trail led me deeper, narrow and overgrown, as if no one had used it for years. I noticed footprints in the damp soil, but they weren't human, or if they were, they weren't recent. They twisted and doubled back in impossible ways. I paused, rationalizing them as deer prints, but the impressions of toes, or what looked like toes, spoke differently. My pulse quickened again, and I felt that same presence from the night before, patient and quiet, just beyond the trees. I returned to the van, trying to ground myself with mundane tasks. Coffee, a few bites of cold granola, checking the map again. That's when I noticed the first tangible sign that something was off. My van, which I had locked tightly the night before, had the sliding door slightly ajar. I swore I had closed it. Nothing seemed missing, but there were scratches along the edge, fresh and deep, like claws had dragged across the metal. My hands trembled as I closed the door, fumbling with the lock multiple times to reassure myself. I told myself to stop thinking like a paranoid camper, that I just imagined the scratches. But the unease had sunk too deep now. I packed up hastily, deciding to leave for another campsite farther north. As I merged back onto the highway, I glanced at the mile markers. They had changed. Instead of 74, I passed 73 again, then 72. My stomach dropped, a cold knot twisting itself tighter with every mile. I stopped the van, cut the engine, and sat frozen, staring at the marker. How could this happen? I had turned around, retraced my path precisely, and yet the markers regressed. The forest seemed denser, older, pressing in from both sides like a living wall. The van felt smaller, trapped. I tried rationalizing it, wrong turn, parallel road, some kind of optical illusion, but every explanation failed. The tapping started again, faint at first, then louder, as if echoing from the metal frame of the van itself. My heartbeat matched it unconsciously. I didn't want to move, but I also couldn't stay. I pressed the accelerator gently, trying to stay calm, but the road twisted unnaturally, sharper than it should have, and shadows stretched over the asphalt like the fingers of something reaching up from below. I glimpsed movement in the trees. Too fast, too deliberate for an animal. It darted from one trunk to another, disappearing and reappearing just beyond the range of my headlights. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but which way? Each turn led me back to the same mile marker. By late afternoon, the sun had dropped and the forest grew ominous, heavy with shadow and scent of decay. I spotted another campsite, or what appeared to be one. An old fire ring, stones blackened with soot, logs arranged haphazardly. No path led here, no road visible, yet here it was, like it had always existed, just out of reach. I pulled in, heart hammering, hands gripping the steering wheel. I told myself I would stay only long enough to rest, but as soon as I turned off the van, the tapping began anew, slow, deliberate, circling. The smell of smoke intensified, acrid and bitter, clinging to my clothes. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt them, just beyond vision, watching, patient. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound was amplified. The crack of a branch, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves. But the tapping persisted, never closer, never farther, just a constant rhythm against my nerves. I thought about leaving, but the road outside looped impossibly back to the same mile marker. I realized then that escape might not be a matter of distance, but of understanding, of noticing something I had missed. Morning brought no relief. I opened the sliding door cautiously, half expecting someone or something to be waiting. The forest was still, unnaturally so, the silence pressing against my eardrums. I tried to follow a trail, any trail, but it led me back to the same old fire ring. Footprints circled it endlessly, some deep and wide, others thin and human-like, all converging at impossible angles. My reflection caught in the van window startled me. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself, eyes wide, pale, and desperate. I whispered to myself, "This isn't real, it's just fear." But the air seemed to thicken, press heavier. The forest was alive, waiting, patient. I finally realized that moving forward blindly would only trap me further. I had to understand the rhythm of the place, the logic of the loops. I started paying attention to the tapping, the scratches on the van, the shifting shadows. There was a pattern, subtle but present, like the forest itself was teaching me a language I had long ignored. Each knock, each mark, each bend in the road was a warning, a lesson, a way to navigate without succumbing to the panic that threatened to swallow me whole. I cannot overstate how small, how fragile I felt in that forest. The road stretched endlessly, mile markers repeating like a cruel joke. Each time I thought I had left, I had only returned, as if the van and I were caught in a kind of trap laid out long before I arrived. The fear was real, gnawing at my instincts. But the moment I stopped fighting it, stopped resisting what I couldn't yet see, the rhythm shifted. I learned to move with it, to anticipate the turns, the shadows, the taps. I don't know if I will ever fully explain what happened on that stretch of road. Some things you understand only in survival, in the quiet moments when your heart and mind learn to speak the same language as the place that holds you. What I do know is that by morning, when the sun finally broke through in earnest, the mile markers began to climb again, slowly, reassuringly. 74, 75, 76. The forest relaxed slightly, the tapping faded to nothing, and though I was exhausted, shaken to my core, I finally felt the first real sense of control. I had learned to listen, to move with caution, to respect a road that would not bend for me, that would not be cheated. I drove on, my van humming beneath me, the forest thinning at last. Every glance in the rearview mirror carried the weight of that quiet, patient presence that had followed me, and I knew that somewhere behind me, mile 73 waited, as it always had, for the next traveler who thought they could escape. Even as the forest thinned, the unease lingered, heavy in my chest, like a shadow that refused to leave. The road opened up, patches of sunlight cutting through the trees, and I forced myself to breathe, to believe that the ordeal was behind me. But I couldn't shake the sense that the woods were watching, that every bend and stretch of asphalt might still hide something patient and waiting. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, knuckles white, listening for the familiar rhythm of taps that had once haunted me, half expecting it to resume at any moment. I pulled over at a small overlook to collect myself. From this height, the valley below looked serene, almost impossibly so, as if the forest had put on a mask for anyone passing through. I stepped out of the van, the gravel crunching under my boots, and tried to force myself to relax. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine mixed with faint smoke from somewhere below. I realized that despite the fear, despite the sleepless night, I felt alive in a way I hadn't for months. The tension had sharpened my senses, made me hyper-aware of the world around me, and even though the fear lingered, there was something almost intoxicating about it. I drank from my thermos, eyes scanning the horizon, when I saw movement. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone crossing the ridgeline, but as I squinted, I realized it didn't move like a human. It was upright, yes, vaguely humanoid, but the limbs seemed elongated, awkward, like it had grown into the shapes of the trees themselves. It paused, as if sensing me, and then melted back into the forest, indistinct but impossible to ignore. My pulse spiked, and I stumbled back toward the van, fumbling for the keys, trying to convince myself it was a trick of light, a shadow stretching across the slope. But deep down, I knew I had seen something real, or at least something that could only exist here in this strange, repeating section of road. I forced myself to move forward, hands trembling, heart hammering. The van rattled along curves that seemed longer than they should have been, mile markers creeping ahead in odd increments, then stalling again. 78. 78. 77. I realized I had stopped expecting the markers to make sense. They weren't there to guide me. They were there to measure my patience, to test how I would react when the familiar rules of the road no longer applied. Every instinct screamed to flee, but fleeing meant nothing. I had learned that much. By late afternoon, I saw a sign for another campsite, less decrepit than the one at mile 73, but still weathered, abandoned looking. The gravel path leading to it was overgrown, lined with brambles that scratched at the van's paint. I parked, heart hammering, telling myself I would only stay long enough to rest and eat, to regroup. As I opened the sliding door, I noticed footprints in the soft earth. Human, but strangely wide, the toes too long, almost claw-like. They led toward the forest, then vanished. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to ignore them, but my imagination twisted them into shapes I couldn't unsee. I set up the small stove, boiling water for coffee, when I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. It wasn't a voice I recognized, not anyone I knew. It was something older, patient, careful, like the forest itself was speaking. I froze, gripping the van door, listening. The whisper repeated, subtle syllables I couldn't understand but somehow felt familiar, pressing against my memory like a half-remembered dream. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and for a moment I considered leaving right then, van or not. But the road, that cursed stretch of highway, had taught me that haste only made the situation worse. I had to move with it, to respect it. Night fell fast, the kind of darkness that swallows shapes whole. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, but the whispering continued, mingled with tapping, with rustling, with sounds that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I imagined figures moving between the trees, watching, waiting for me to panic. Sleep came in short, trembling fits, haunted by dreams of endless road, mile markers spiraling backwards, the van swallowed by the forest. I woke to the sound of scraping, something moving along the roof, deliberate, slow. My pulse spiked, and I froze, listening. The sound moved along the length of the van, then stopped. Silence. By morning, the sun barely pierced the canopy. I didn't linger outside. Instead, I packed quickly, hands shaking as I checked the van doors, the locks, everything. The road ahead seemed longer than before, curves sharper, shadows deeper. I realized then that the forest didn't want me to drive blindly. It wanted me to observe, to notice patterns, to survive by paying attention. Each strange sound, each unnatural shadow, each mile marker that refused to climb was a lesson. I had no choice but to heed it. As I drove, I noticed subtle shifts, the way the light fell, the rhythm of the tapping in the distance, the strange alignment of trees along the roadside. I began to move with them, adjusting speed, watching for cues. It felt almost like a dance, my van negotiating with a forest that seemed aware, alive, and patient beyond measure. When I made even the smallest error, a misjudged curve, a late glance at a shadow, the tapping would resume as if to correct me, to remind me I wasn't in control here. I pulled off again near another overlook, a small ridge that gave a view of the valley below. The landscape stretched endlessly, deceptively calm, and for a moment I felt a strange, hollow peace. I realized then that fear had sharpened me, made me notice things I had ignored in everyday life. Patterns in the wind, rhythms in sound, shifts in light. The forest was cruel, yes, but it was teaching me something essential: attention, patience, respect. I had survived because I had learned to listen, to trust instinct over assumption, to observe over panic. As the sun rose higher, the mile markers finally began climbing steadily. 79, 80, 81. I dared to hope, to believe I was finally leaving that cursed stretch behind. Yet even as the van hummed beneath me, I couldn't shake the feeling that mile 73 was still there, waiting for the next traveler, patient as ever, teaching lessons in the only way it knew how. By late afternoon, the forest thinned almost completely. The road straightened, pavement smooth and familiar. I exhaled, relief washing over me, a trembling gratitude that I couldn't fully articulate. My hands relaxed on the wheel, but even then I knew I would remember the tapping, the whispers, the forest that refused to yield. The road had taught me something I couldn't learn anywhere else. Respect for the unknown, patience for the impossible, and the awareness that fear, when faced with attention and care, could become something instructive, something that sharpened the mind and the spirit. I drove on, mile markers climbing, sun spilling gold across the asphalt, but I carried the memory of 73 with me. The quiet patience, the subtle lessons, the forest that had almost claimed me. I knew I would return to the road someday. Perhaps not this stretch, perhaps not this forest, but somewhere where the line between the ordinary and the impossible blurred. And when I did, I would remember, the forest doesn't need to chase you. It only waits. And if you listen, if you respect it, it might just teach you how to survive. Even as the road opened, the forest's presence lingered, not in shadow or sound, but in my mind. Every mile marker, Every bend, every curve reminded me that I hadn't just driven through a stretch of asphalt. I had driven through something older, something patient, something that measured me as I moved through it. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, but there was a difference now, a crispness, a clarity, as if the forest had released me, acknowledging that I had paid attention, that I had learned the language it had tried to teach. Yet fear still clung to me, stubborn and alive. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see shadows pressing close behind the van or a figure emerging from the thinning trees. There was nothing but sunlight and the road stretching onward. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that 73, 74, 75, all those markers weren't just numbers. They were milestones of endurance, tests of patience, points along a road that refused shortcuts. Every mile I passed was a reminder that survival wasn't about speed. It was about awareness, humility, and presence. By late afternoon, I found a small turnout that overlooked a winding river far below. I parked, knees shaking, and stepped out of the van. The world felt impossibly quiet, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. The tapping, the whispering, the strange shadows, all gone. Yet in the stillness, I felt an echo of them, a pulse beneath the hum of nature. I traced the bends of the river with my eyes and realized that the road I had taken, the forest I had moved through, had changed me. I was no longer just a driver on a quiet highway. I was someone who had walked the thin line between fear and understanding, someone who had confronted the unknown without surrendering to panic. I sat on the hood of the van, letting the sun warm my face, and thought about the lessons I had been forced to learn. Fear is not a weakness, it is a guide. Attention is not obsession, it is survival. And the world, even when it seems to twist reality into impossible forms, is not always meant to be dominated. Sometimes it is meant to teach. I could feel the residue of anxiety melting into a kind of awe, a respect for the quiet patience of the forest, for the road that would not end, for the rhythm that had dictated every choice, every movement I had made. As the sun dipped lower, I started the van and merged back onto the highway. Mile markers climbed steadily now, each number a confirmation that I was moving forward, leaving behind the section that had nearly swallowed me whole. Yet I knew that somewhere, hidden in the folds of shadow and trees, mile 73 still waited, patient and unyielding, for someone else who might ignore its lessons. I understood that survival on this road wasn't about running faster or being braver. It was about listening, about respecting what you cannot fully see or understand. The hum of the van beneath me became comforting, almost rhythmic, echoing the lessons I had learned. The forest receded, the light deepened, and for the first time since I had arrived, I smiled. Not out of relief alone, but out of understanding. I had been tested, terrified, and almost undone, but I had emerged more aware, more attentive, more present. The experience had stripped away illusions of control, showing me the raw, patient power of a world that refuses to bend for our convenience. By evening, I reached the edge of the forest. The road widened, traffic returning, sounds of human life creeping back. I slowed the van, breathing deeply, savoring the transition from the strange, looping stretch of highway to normality. And yet, even in the familiar, I carried the forest with me, the tapping, the whispers, the lessons embedded deep in my awareness. I knew I would never forget mile 73. I knew that if I ever returned to the road, I would move differently, with more care, more observation, more humility. I parked near a small diner, lights flickering warmly in the early evening, and stepped out. The night felt ordinary, but I sensed the extraordinary had touched me, lingering like a shadow at the edge of vision. I realized that horror is not always about sudden terror. It is about patience, about the quiet pressure that forces you to confront your own limits. It is about being tested in a place where the rules bend and realizing that the lessons are in survival itself, not just in escape. As I sipped coffee at a booth by the window, watching cars roll past, I understood what the road had given me. The fear, the unease, the tapping in the distance, they were not punishments. They were teachers, and the road, stubborn and endless, had ensured that I learned. I had survived, yes, but more importantly, I had listened. I had seen. I had moved with awareness, with respect, with patience. And that, I realized, was more powerful than any amount of speed, bravery, or planning. I started the van one last time, the engine humming a steady, confident rhythm beneath me. The highway stretched ahead, open, ordinary, but I knew the lesson would stay with me forever. Mile 73 would always exist somewhere, not just on asphalt, not just in trees, but in the quiet spaces of my awareness, waiting to remind me that attention, patience, and respect are what allow us to navigate the impossible. And as I drove into the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, I understood this fully. The road may never end, and the forest may never yield. But if you move with care, if you watch, if you listen, if you learn, you can survive. You can emerge changed, sharpened, alive in a way that fear alone cannot give. And sometimes that is the most extraordinary thing of all. I always tell people that the mountains don't try to scare you on purpose. They don't whisper, they don't roar, they don't play tricks on your mind. They simply exist, massive and unmoving. But it's in that silence, that endless quiet pressure, where the real fear begins. Because when everything out there in the Colorado backcountry feels ancient and alert, you start questioning if you even belong in a place so wild. And the night I learned that lesson, I learned it hard. My name is Tyler, 43 years old, and I've been full-timing in my RV for most of the last 6. I've parked in deserts, forests, washed-out campgrounds, gravel turnouts along lonely highways. I've seen storms roll across the plains like living creatures, watched snow swallow an entire ridge in a matter of minutes, and sat alone in the silence of places so remote that even my own breathing felt intrusive. But nothing ever tested me the way Colorado's grizzly country did that week. People joke that Colorado doesn't have grizzlies anymore, that they vanished decades ago, that every so-called sighting is just a misidentified brown bear or the overactive imagination of a city hiker. But locals know better. They say if you go far enough, quiet enough, long enough without seeing another soul, you'll feel something watching from above tree line. You won't see it at first, you won't hear it, you'll just feel the presence of something that remembers a time long before you ever existed. Something that never forgot how to hunt. I'd been camped near a place called Granite Basin, tucked deep in the San Juan Mountains. Officially, it's just dispersed camping. No hookups, no amenities, no ranger checks, just you and whatever decides to wander through in the night. I'd chosen it because I wanted solitude. I'd been carrying around this old frustration from my past job, something that made me feel like I was constantly failing, constantly behind. I'd convinced myself that the only way to clear my mind was to park my RV somewhere the world couldn't find me. Somewhere quiet enough that maybe I could hear myself think for once. But quiet is a deceptive thing. It feels peaceful until it feels like pressure, until it feels like a weight on your chest. The first night, the air smelled sharp, like cold pine and river stones, the kind of smell that makes you breathe deeper. I'd parked the RV just before sunset, leveled it out on a patch of ground framed by aspen trees, and stepped outside to let my body settle after hours of mountain driving. There were distant snowcaps glowing pink with the last bit of light, and the wind combed through the trees in long, steady strokes. Everything looked perfect, exactly the kind of remote beauty I'd been craving. But even then, before anything happened, I remember feeling watched. Not in a dramatic horror movie way, more like the woods themselves were evaluating me, like the whole basin was deciding if I'd earned the right to be there. I ignored it, because that's what you do when you live on the road long enough. You get that prickle of instinct, that whisper of hashrying. Maybe I shouldn't be here, and you drown it under practical reasoning. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself a lot of things that would later feel like lies. As the sun went down, the cold rose fast. Colorado mountains don't give you the luxury of a gentle transition. Darkness drops like a curtain. By 8 o'clock, the sky was a deep navy, full of more stars than I'd seen in months. I'd cooked a simple dinner on my propane stove, then stepped outside with my bowl just to hear the quiet. That was the first time I noticed the silence wasn't right. There were no crickets, no night birds, no distant trickle from the creek I'd passed on the way up. Even the wind had died completely. It was as if the whole forest had tightened its breath at the same time, holding in, waiting. I stood there with a spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. At first I thought it was just me, maybe the altitude messing with my senses. But then the ground seemed to hum, just barely. Not a vibration, not a tremor. More like the earth was exhaling beneath the soil, a long, subtle breath I felt more in my ribs than in my ears. A rational mind says, that's ridiculous. But the primal part of my brain, the part that understands threat long before logic kicks in, whispered, something big is out there. It took everything in me to go back inside the RV, close the door, and pretend I wasn't shaken. I locked the deadbolt, even though I'd never locked it in camp before. I shut the shades, even though I usually loved falling asleep to the view outside. My heartbeat felt uncomfortably loud, echoing in my ears like I'd been running. I told myself again that I was tired, that my nerves were just picking up on the loneliness of the place, that fear was just a shape made by the dark. It almost worked, until the first sound came. A single heavy footstep outside, not close, not right up against the RV, but close enough that the dirt shifted in a way I recognized. Weight, distributed deliberately, something large placing its foot with the kind of confidence only a top predator has. I froze. Another step. Then silence. The side of the RV felt thinner than aluminum in that moment. I imagined claws, teeth, old instincts awakened by the smell of a human in their territory. I pictured something massive standing just beyond the thin wall, breathing slow and steady, the way a bear decides whether something is prey or problem. When the third step came, it was closer. The fear that swelled up inside me wasn't the panicked kind. Not yet. It was the deep, internal kind that makes your body feel hollow, like your soul dropped through the floor. I reached for the switch to turn off the interior lights. My fingers trembled. When the RV went dark, something shifted outside. A faint scrape, like claws brushing against stone. I pressed my back to the far wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. The silence returned, thick and total. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was an hour. Time gets strange when fear narrows your world down to one sound, one breath, one moment. I waited for more footsteps, more movement, any sign of what was out there, but nothing came, and maybe that should have comforted me. Maybe I should have thought, it's gone. But the dread only tightened because I realized what was actually scaring me. Whatever was out there wasn't wandering. It was waiting. I barely slept. Every time the wind shifted or the metal of the RV contracted with temperature changes, I flinched. I kept imagining the shape of something massive outside the window, something that could cross the clearing in seconds if it chose to. By morning, the world looked harmless again. Bright sun, clean air, patches of frost melting into dew. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching all night. And when I finally stepped outside, the truth greeted me immediately. Tracks. Huge tracks. Not black bear, not brown bear. Bigger, deeper, more deliberate. My stomach dropped, my throat tightened. All my denial, all my attempts to rationalize vanished. Something had circled my RV. Not once. Not twice, but over and over, pacing, waiting, and looking at those tracks, I realized the real terror hadn't even begun yet. The first thing I noticed about the tracks was the depth. The soil around Granite Basin wasn't soft. It was that dense, compacted mix of pine needles, old earth, and broken shale. Even a big rig driving over it barely left a mark. But whatever had circled my RV had sunk its weight deep enough to compress the ground more than an inch. The prints were spaced far apart, too far to belong to any average bear. And the shape, good God, the shape wasn't quite right. Not rounded like black bear paws. Not the wide, almost flat heel of a grizzly's hindfoot either. These looked elongated, heavy on the forefoot, as if whatever made them leaned forward when it moved. The morning sunlight stretched down through the aspens like gold-colored fingers, making everything feel deceptively peaceful. Birds chirped again. Squirrels rustled through brush, bold and busy. The whole forest had resumed its usual rhythm, as if nothing had happened. But when I crouched to get a closer look at those tracks, the back of my neck prickled with the same dread I'd felt in the dark. I'd spent years trying to trust my instincts on the road. You learn to do that after enough strange nights in the wild, but this time instinct didn't whisper. It screamed. Something big had come close, something curious, and something that wasn't afraid of getting right up near the thing that sheltered me. I pulled back toward the RV slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest felt wrong again. Not silent, not yet, but listening. The way a classroom quiets when the teacher pauses mid-sentence. Like everything was waiting for something important to happen. I needed distance. Perspective. Something to ground me. So I grabbed my pack and hiked up a narrow trail that climbed a ridge about half a mile behind camp. From there, I could see down into the basin, a wide, open bowl wrapped in jagged peaks, with my small campsite looking like a speck of color against the forest floor. The air was so thin and clean it hurt my lungs. My breath puffed out in white clouds, even though the sun was high. But the longer I looked, the more wrong everything seemed. The tracks weren't just around the RV, they were everywhere. Circling wide, narrowing in, then looping out again, as if something had spent hours pacing, watching, waiting for me to show myself. I told myself I should leave. I should pack up right then. But stubbornness is its own kind of sickness. I'd come out there to clear my mind, to face whatever it was inside me that kept running from problems. And a part of me recoiled at the idea of letting fear chase me off after just one night. That was my mistake. On the way down the ridge, I heard something move parallel to me, a soft crunch, then another. Not rushed, not frantic, just matching my pace. I stopped. It stopped. I walked again. It walked again. Always far enough that I couldn't see it through the trees, but close enough that every hair on my arms rose. Probably a deer, I muttered, though my voice didn't carry conviction. Deer don't move like that. They're jumpy, uncertain, always bounding or darting. This was different. This was methodical. Halfway back to camp, the smell hit me. Sharp, metallic, like blood on cold stone. It drifted on the wind, so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. But then it came stronger, lifting the back of my throat, making my eyes water. Something animal, something wrong. I froze and listened, heart thumping in my chest, fingers tightening around the straps of my pack. The woods were quiet again. Not the natural quiet of a calm morning, but that suffocating hush I'd felt the night before, a silence that felt inhabited. I forced myself to keep walking. The sooner I got back to camp, the sooner I could decide whether I should leave. But every step felt watched, judged. I kept glancing between the trees, expecting to see a shadow slip behind a trunk or a shape too large to belong to anything normal. When the RV finally came into view, something inside me sagged with relief. But that relief died fast. The prints were closer now. Fresh. Whatever had been out there had returned while I was gone. I checked the door. Locked. Windows still shut. Everything looked untouched. But the forest around me pulsed with that metallic scent as if the air had been stirred by something enormous passing through. Fear crept higher into my chest. I tried to shove it down, tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a cougar, I told myself. Maybe the tracks distorted in the cold. Maybe altitude was messing with me. But denial can only stretch so thin before it snaps. By afternoon, clouds began crawling in from the west, thick gray ones that clung low over the peaks. A storm was rolling in. I debated breaking camp, but the mountain pass I'd driven up was narrow, steep, and unforgiving. One good storm could wash out sections of the road, leaving me stuck or sliding. So I stayed. As the sky darkened, something inside me tightened. I felt the night arriving early, the way the forest seemed to shrink inward, pulling its edges close. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away. Lightning flickered above the ridge like silent white flame. Inside the RV, the thin metal walls amplified every sound: the tick of cooling appliances, the faint groan of wind pushing against the structure, the shifting pop of settling seams. I tried distracting myself, read a book, clean the kitchenette, reorganize my gear, but my mind kept drifting back to the tracks, the pacing, the smell. By dusk, rain began tapping on the roof, soft at first, then harder. The wind picked up. The aspens outside shivered with each gust, their white trunks wavering like ghosts in the dark. And then something hit the side of the RV. It wasn't a tree branch, wasn't blown debris. It was too deliberate, too heavy, a single thud. Then another, lower and slower, almost a knock. I held my breath, staring at the wall as if I could see through it. The rain muffled everything, but that sound cut through it like a blade. Thud. This time closer to the back window. I killed the interior lights with a shaky hand. Darkness swallowed the RV instantly, but it felt safer that way, like if I couldn't be seen, I had a better chance of surviving whatever was out there. The rain hammered harder. The wind howled. Leaves and grit scraped against the metal siding. But beneath it all, I heard the third thud, heavier, almost impatient. Fear settled into me like cold water. I crawled toward the back window as quietly as I could, every muscle tight. I eased a fingertip beneath the edge of the curtain, lifted it just enough to see outside. The storm made everything blurry, rain streaking down the glass in chaotic lines. The trees danced wildly, shadows merged. But there, between the flashes of lightning, I saw movement. High, too high for anything on four legs. A shape, massive shoulders, the faint arc of something like fur slicked down by rain. A silhouette standing upright but hunched forward as if leaning on its forelimbs. The breath left my lungs. Lightning flashed again, and it was gone. Not vanished, just stepped back into the dark, into the blur of trees and storm where it could watch unseen. My pulse pounded in my ears so hard I felt dizzy. I backed away from the window, heart slamming against my ribs, my hands shaking uncontrollably now. Instinct screamed at me to run, but where? Into the storm? Into the forest with that thing? The RV felt too small, too fragile, too exposed. The next sound wasn't a thud. It was breathing, slow, heavy. Right outside the door. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. The creature exhaled again, longer this time. The rain softened just enough for me to hear the low rumble beneath that breath. Not a growl, a warning. I'd stepped into something else's territory, and it wasn't asking me to leave, it was deciding. The creature's breathing stayed steady, deep, like it was filling the entire night with its presence. Each exhale fogged through the seams of the doorframe, making the cold inside the RV sharpen until it bit the skin of my arms. I didn't move. Couldn't. My whole body had locked itself in place, the way you do when a nightmare suddenly realizes you're awake. The rain softened, but the wind didn't. It continued to drag long streaks of sound across the metal walls, but underneath that roar, the slow inhale, the heavy exhale, never faltered. I almost whispered something, some instinctual plea, maybe, but I felt in my chest that any sound I made would break whatever thin, fragile boundary kept the creature from tearing through the door. So I stayed still, the way a rabbit freezes under a hawk's shadow. Lightning flashed again. The creature shifted its weight. My heart dropped. The sound wasn't subtle. Whatever it was braced one enormous arm or paw against the RV's siding, and the entire vehicle jolted. Not violently, no. That would have been almost easier. This was slow, controlled strength, a deliberate push, a test. The metal groaned, the windows rattled, my vision tunneled, shrinking to the foot of space in front of me. My palms were sweating, my teeth clenched. I realized I was holding my breath, and when I finally exhaled, it came out shaky and loud in the dark. Too loud. The breathing outside stopped. My stomach twisted into a tight, nauseating knot. For a moment, there was nothing. No rain, no wind, no thunder. Just the black, suffocating quiet of something thinking, considering, shifting its focus. Then an eye appeared in the window. Just one. It was enormous, larger than my palm. I pressed close enough that the fog from its breath smeared across the glass. Not a bear's eye. Not round, not glassy, not dull. This one held focus, intelligence, like it was studying me the same way I was studying it. Its color chilled me more than anything, a deep amber, almost glowing. And even through the distortion of rain lines and darkness, I saw the pupil narrow, adjusting to the faint light inside. It was looking for me. When I flinched back instinctively, the silhouette raised slightly. The top of its head scraped the window frame, another low, controlled movement of something that was far too tall to fit any known profile. A quiet sound came from its throat. Not quite a growl, not a snort. Something older. Something that vibrated through the metal and into my bones. I crawled backward until my shoulders hit the opposite wall. My breaths came fast now, harsh and shallow. The creature shifted again, and the entire RV leaned as its weight pressed against one side. Then came a sound I'll never forget, the long, slow drag of claws across metal. The noise sliced through the storm, a high, deliberate screech that made my teeth ache. Not random, not accidental. It felt like a message. I know you're in there. I know you're hiding, and I know you're afraid. Terror rose through me in a violent wave. My hands scrambled for something, anything I could use as a weapon, but what did I have? A hatchet, a kitchen knife, a flashlight. None of it mattered. Nothing I carried could stop something that could move an RV with a single shift of its shoulders. Thunder cracked. Rain fell heavier again, and just as suddenly as it appeared, the eye withdrew from the window. I heard its breath retreat, slow and steady. One step, then another, then another. I remained frozen on the floor for what felt like an hour, waiting for the next impact, the next breath, the next claw against metal. But nothing came. Slowly, painfully, the night returned to normal. The sound of rain, the moaning wind, the distant roll of thunder. But I didn't move. My body refused to accept that danger had paused. When my muscles finally unlocked enough for me to stand, I turned on the smallest light I had, just a dim, warm lamp that barely touched the interior. The shadows inside the RV felt alive, as if they might shift into that same silhouette if I blinked too long. I didn't sleep, I didn't sit. I stood in the center of the small aisle space, breathing shallow and quick, listening to every creak, every gust, every shift of rain on the roof. Sometime after midnight, the storm faded. The wind died. The rain thinned to a scattered drizzle. And that was when I heard the faint sound again, farther away this time but unmistakable, a low, rhythmic breathing. Not human, not bear. Something else. It was still out there, still watching, still waiting. I stayed awake until the first hint of light touched the edges of the windows. Those pale blue streaks spread across the sky like relief finally arriving. When the sun rose enough to show the forest in color again, the dread inside me didn't vanish, but it loosened. I waited another 15 minutes before stepping outside. My boots sank into the wet ground, and the cold morning air cut through the thin layer of fierce sweat on my skin. The forest smelled like rain and pine. But beneath that, faint and metallic, was the same scent from before, the scent of blood on stone. The first thing I saw was the scratch mark. It ran across the length of my RV's side panel, 3 long, deep grooves, each one nearly 2 feet long. They hadn't dented the metal, they had carved through it. Bears don't do that, cougars don't do that. Anything that could do that didn't belong in any wildlife guide. My voice croaked out of me before I even thought, "What the hell are you?" The rest of the scene made my stomach twist harder. Tracks surrounded the RV again, fresher this time, more deliberate. The pacing wasn't wide like before, it was tight, focused, like the creature had circled closer, gauging me through the metal walls. But the tracks led somewhere else too, up the ridge, toward the trail I'd hiked the day before, and farther up, toward the old fire road that disappeared into higher elevation. Territory no one used anymore. Territory locals warned hikers away from, with a shrug and a quiet, "It ain't safe past there, man." I followed the tracks with my eyes, not my feet. I didn't need to get closer. I already knew what they meant. It had followed me yesterday, and now it had followed its own path deeper into the mountains. Waiting. Choosing. Maybe hunting. I forced myself to step back inside and start packing. I couldn't stay another hour. Every second I lingered felt like an invitation, as if the creature might return the moment I dropped my guard. By the time I finally turned the ignition, my hands were trembling so hard I could barely grip the wheel. The tires snapped twigs and sloshed through mud as I rolled out of the clearing. The forest felt tighter, narrower, like the trees leaned inward to watch me go. But as I drove down the mountain pass, something gnawed at me. Every corner I turned, every bend in the road, every shadow between trunks, I felt it there. Not following behind, not watching from afar, but traveling parallel through the forest, matching my pace, keeping me in sight. My breath caught when I glimpsed something between the trees, a flash of amber just for a second before vanishing behind a ridge, a warning, or a promise. I pressed harder on the accelerator. It didn't matter. The thing kept pace. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, early sunlight filling the valley below, I thought I was safe, that I'd outrun it, that I'd crossed some invisible border where that creature's claim over the land ended. But when I pulled over at a turnout to steady my hands, to breathe, to tell myself the worst was over, I saw it, in the thin layer of dust on the back window of my RV, 3 long, fresh claw marks. Not carved deep like the ones on the metal, but drawn lightly, deliberately, as if the creature wanted me to know, you left my territory, but I did not forget you, and I do not forgive you. I stared at the claw marks on the back window long enough for my breath to fog the glass. The marks weren't deep, but they were unmistakable. 3 long strokes, drawn with care, not the random swipe of an animal, not the panic of prey, but the deliberate, precise movement of something that knew I'd see it, something that understood the message it was leaving behind. The morning sun glinted through the dust, illuminating each thin groove like a brand burned into the RV itself. My knees felt weak. My fingers trembled against the door handle. But the fear didn't come in a burst this time. It came slowly, curling in the base of my spine, like a cold serpent uncoiling itself. I wasn't imagining anything. I wasn't overreacting. The creature had been real. It had watched me, followed me, tested me, and even now, hours from the basin, far from the ridge where it had breathed against the door, it remembered me. There are moments in life when your choices tighten into a narrow path, when instinct rises up like a voice that's too close to ignore. And standing there beside the turnout, with the dust blowing across the pavement and the vast Colorado Valley opening beneath me, that voice whispered something clear: run. But do not run blind. Fear makes you stupid if you let it. It makes you crash your rig, lose sight of the road, forget the basics of survival. And I couldn't afford stupidity. So I forced a deep breath into my lungs, wiped the sweat from my palms, and climbed back into the driver's seat. The air inside the RV tasted stale, like the residue of panic clinging to every corner. The rearview mirror showed me the dusty back window again. The claw marks seemed to glow faintly where the morning light hit them. I turned the key. The engine rumbled awake, shaking the floor beneath my boots. And only then, only once I felt the wheels roll forward, did I realize something heavy was still sitting in my chest. I wasn't just afraid of the creature. I was afraid of the part of me that had felt drawn to stay. I can't explain that part well. But when you've lived alone in an RV long enough, when you've spent thousands of miles with nothing but your own mind echoing around inside your skull, you start searching for something bigger, something that makes the world feel less empty. And when that something finally looks back, you don't forget it. I drove for hours that day, winding through mountain passes, descending into valleys painted with wildflowers and crisscrossed by streams that glimmered like silver veins. I passed cyclists and hikers and families parked at scenic overlooks. Their laughter drifted across the breeze, light and free. And I kept thinking, none of them knew what walked those upper ridges. None of them felt the breath of something older than memory. None of them had seen that amber eye. By early afternoon, I made it to a small town, one of those places where the gas pumps are older than the clerk who watches the store. Dusty storefronts, chipped window frames, a hand-painted sign advertising homemade jerky. It looked completely ordinary. comfortingly so. But when I stepped out of the RV to fuel up, a man sitting on the bench outside the general store lifted his gaze. He wore a weathered hat, sun-cracked boots, and eyes that had seen more wilderness than most people could imagine. He stared at me with a strange, assessing stillness. "You came from up the basin?" he said, not as a question, but as a quiet accusation. I swallowed. "Yeah." His jaw tightened. He leaned forward on his cane. "See anything?" The pause lasted too long. He felt it. I felt it. The air between us changed. I finally said, "Tracks, something big, and something else." The man nodded once, very slowly, as if confirming something he already feared. "They still up there," he murmured. "Some say they're gone, haven't been seen in decades, but the mountain keeps its old blood alive." My skin crawled. "You know what it is?" "No," he said simply, "and that's why I'm still alive." He tapped his cane on the wooden deck, a soft, hollow sound. Then his voice dropped into a rough whisper. "Creatures up there ain't ghosts, ain't myths, ain't stories for campfire fools. They're flesh, bone, hunger." His gaze intensified. "And once one lays eyes on you, it don't forget." My throat dried. "Why not?" He looked toward the distant peaks, shading his eyes with a trembling hand. "Because you're the first new thing it's seen in a long, long while." That answer sank into me like ice water. A feeling of exposure washed over me, like something had marked me, like I'd stepped unknowingly into a territory where the rules were carved into rock long before humans showed up with maps and names. I thanked him, though the words felt hollow. Then I finished fueling and climbed back into the RV. I didn't want to stay in town. I didn't want to linger near the foothills, and I sure didn't want to push north deeper into wilderness. So I took the southern route toward lower elevations, toward warmth, toward the comfort of crowded campgrounds where laughter and campfires and human noises drown out the whisper of old instincts. But the whole drive, I kept checking my mirrors. Not because I expected to see the creature walking openly along the road, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was tracking me. The line where the pines thinned, the shadowed slopes on the right side of the valley, the darker patches between branches. I felt it there, watching, waiting, learning me. When night fell, I stopped at a busy campground off a well-traveled highway. My hands shook as I leveled the RV. Families cooked dinner nearby. Kids shrieked and laughed around a ring of boulders. Someone strummed a guitar under the glow of string lights. All the normal sounds of humanity returned, and with them a fragile sense of safety. Yet when I finally lay down in my bed that night, exhaustion heavy in my bones, I felt another emotion creep in. Not fear, not dread, something like awe. Because the creature hadn't attacked me. It hadn't torn into the RV. It had tested me. Yes, it had stalked me, but every movement had been measured, intentional. It hadn't acted like a mindless predator. It acted like something that recognized, something that expected something from me, something that wasn't finished with me yet. I drifted into a shallow sleep with those thoughts twisting through my mind. And sometime in the middle of the night, when the campground was at its quietest, a sound snapped me awake. 3 soft knocks on the back window, not violent, not aggressive, just a reminder, a message, a promise. My blood went cold. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, listening as the knocks faded into nothing. When I finally found the courage to look toward the back window, I saw nothing through the moonlit curtain, but I felt it there, an awareness, a presence, a patience that no wild animal should possess. And right then, I understood something deep and terrifying. I hadn't escaped the mountains. I had carried them with me. Whatever walked those ridges, whatever watched me from beyond the tree line, whatever dragged its claws across metal and dust, it now knew me, my scent, my voice, my fear. And in its old, wild mind, that meant something. Something binding, something unfinished. I lay awake until dawn, heart tight, breath shallow, staring at the dim outline of my roof. And as light finally crept back into the world, warm and golden, I whispered to myself with a shaky certainty, some places aren't meant to be visited. Some places choose you, and some places, some ancient, hungry places, they follow you home. I've always believed that the forest speaks, even when you don't want to hear it. That first night at Ashwood Bunker, I realized how loud it could be when you're alone, when your only companions are the whispering trees and the echo of your own heartbeat. The drive in my old rusty Volkswagen van had been long and quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start imagining conversations in the shadows. I had parked on the outer edge of the campground, where the trees bent over the narrow gravel road and the moonlight barely touched the mossy floor. My plan was simple: a weekend of solitude, of empty air, of small joys, campfire coffee, writing in my journal, and sleeping with the van doors wide open to the night. I didn't know anyone at Ashwood Bunker. The locals, when I'd asked online forums, had described it as remote but friendly, a place to stretch your legs and disappear for a while. That's not how I felt when I arrived. There was no one. Just a scattering of tents I couldn't reach without straining my eyes, and a fading gravel road that ended in something resembling a clearing. The air smelled faintly metallic, like wet iron, and under it, something sweet and cloying I couldn't place. My instinct urged me to leave, but I convinced myself it was just the forest. By sunset, the campsite had settled into its usual rhythm. Birds calling their last songs, the wind through the pines, the occasional snap of a twig that sounded startlingly deliberate. I pulled out a small propane stove and started boiling water, the hiss and clink grounding me in the mundane. That's when I noticed it, the faint scratching beneath the ground, rhythmic, almost like nails on wood. I froze, listening. It was too steady, too slow for an animal my brain recognized. My first thought was roots scratching against something. My rational side laughed at me for imagining it, but as night fell, the scratching didn't stop. It changed. The rhythm became irregular, dragging now like something heavy shifting underground. I couldn't ignore it. I cursed under my breath and told myself to check it in the morning, not wanting to dig into paranoia before dark. I poured the boiling water over instant coffee grounds, inhaling the bitter steam and trying to calm the pulse in my temples. The van felt like a sanctuary, small and familiar against the darkness pressing in, but even then, I noticed how the shadows moved differently tonight, elongated, writhing in corners of my vision. I tried to sleep, curling up on the bench seat with a thin blanket. The van creaked and groaned like it had its own life, and I pretended it was normal. But around 2 a.m., the scratching returned, louder, closer, no longer just under the earth, but seeming to scrape against the van itself. My chest tightened. I wanted to convince myself it was just a branch, a raccoon, maybe even wind caught in the tires, but the sound was too deliberate. It circled, paused, shifted. I lay there frozen, counting breaths until a scream tore through the night. Not human, not animal, but something in between, guttural and desperate. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it, the shadow moving beyond the van's fogged-up window, just at the tree line. I blinked, thinking my mind was replaying the sound, but it didn't disappear. It stretched across the clearing in a way no human should, limbs too long, the head bending oddly, a silhouette swallowed in the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the figure. Nothing, only the trees. The moonlight revealed nothing, as if the earth had swallowed the intruder whole, and yet the sound persisted, soft, insistent, like someone digging just beneath the surface. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a hatchet from under the driver's seat and trying to rationalize every creak and rustle. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it, that fear had turned the natural into something monstrous. I decided to explore, hoping daylight would banish the phantoms. That's when I met her. Mara, a local in her mid-30s, hair tied back in a messy braid, face smudged with dirt and a strange serenity. She was moving through the campsite with a small pack, checking on empty fire pits, her eyes steady on me as if she had known I'd be there. "You're camping alone?" she asked, voice soft but edged with caution. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound confident. "First time here." She nodded slowly. "Most people don't stay long. This place, it changes them." Her words hung in the air, too heavy to brush off. I asked her what she meant, and she shook her head, smiling faintly. "You'll see." Then she walked away, leaving a trail of disturbed leaves. The forest felt different after that. Sharper, watching, alive with eyes I couldn't see. That afternoon, I wandered toward the old bunker everyone on the forums had mentioned in passing. It was half buried, bricks crumbling, hidden under decades of moss and pine needles. I found a narrow entrance, rusted metal doors that groaned when I pushed them aside. Inside, the air was cold, damp, smelling of mildew and iron. Faint graffiti marked the walls, names, dates, messages scratched in panic or boredom. I couldn't tell which. I stepped carefully, flashlight bouncing over empty corridors and shadows. Then I heard it. Soft murmurs, too low to understand, like whispers pressed from the stone itself. Curiosity overrode fear. I moved further in, careful not to touch the walls. The whispers grew louder, forming fragments of words I almost recognized. Pleas, warnings, confessions. My heart raced as I realized the sounds were coming from below, from a shaft hidden under debris. I hesitated, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. I crouched down, peering into the darkness, and my flashlight caught something. Bones, scattered, some broken, some intact, alongside rusted tools and scraps of clothing. A scream erupted from beneath, closer now, suffocating, human yet wrong. I stumbled back, falling over a brick, and my flashlight flickered. The sound stopped instantly, leaving only the echo of my own panicked breaths. I scrambled to the exit, feeling the walls pressing in, the bunker alive with the memory of whoever or whatever had been down there. Outside, the sunlight felt distant, the forest whispering around me. Mara was gone. I could have sworn I'd seen her at the edge of the trees when I left, watching. Or maybe that was fear playing tricks again. By the time I returned to my van, the world felt smaller, tighter, claustrophobic. Every crackle of leaves underfoot, every bird call, every snapping branch made me jump. I couldn't shake the sense that the bunker wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting, and it wanted attention. I slept little that night, listening as the ground whispered beneath me, scratching that same unrelenting rhythm. The sun never seemed to rise enough to bring comfort, the shadows lingering long into noon. In the hours that followed, I noticed patterns. The scratching always came before the whispers always before the shadows. Each cycle felt deliberate, as if the campsite itself had a heartbeat, and I was intruding on its rhythm. Mara reappeared briefly, standing at the edge of my campsite, silent. Her eyes held knowledge, and though she didn't speak, I understood. She knew what lived beneath Ashwood Bunker, and she was testing me, seeing if I would leave or stay. I stayed. And that night the forest didn't just whisper. It called. By midnight, the forest had changed again. The wind died down, leaving the trees motionless, their branches like skeletal fingers scratching at a black sky. I sat in my van, the small cabin light dimmed, listening to the subtle rhythm beneath the earth. The scratching, the murmurs, the unidentifiable shifting that seemed to breathe with the soil. I tried telling myself it was nothing, but even as I said it aloud, the words sounded hollow. I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight, a rope, and a small crowbar. My curiosity had become a kind of compulsion, the same instinct that had driven me into the bunker in broad daylight. I approached the narrow entrance, careful not to make a sound. The forest seemed to recoil around me. Every step crushed pine needles that cracked too sharply in the stillness. The bunker's door groaned under my hand, the sound reverberating down the dark corridor. I swallowed my fear, telling myself I was alone, rationalizing until a whisper brushed against my ear. Not alone. I froze. The voice was soft, a sibilant hiss carried on the air, close enough that I could feel it against my skin. I spun, flashlight swinging. Nothing, just walls, shadows, and the faint metallic scent I had noticed when I arrived. I tried to dismiss it, but the instinct in the pit of my stomach screamed otherwise. I entered the bunker, stepping cautiously over broken bricks and splintered wood, feeling the chill seep through my clothes. Each corridor seemed longer than the last, the flashlight creating distorted shadows that looked almost human. Then I found it, the shaft. the small, square opening in the floor, partially hidden beneath moss and debris. My heart thudded, my fingers trembling as I cleared away the rot and dirt. The murmuring was louder now, almost urgent. It wasn't the wind, not the animals. It was coming from beneath. I lowered the rope, shining my flashlight down. The beam fell on a pit of darkness, walls slick with damp, the faint glint of something metallic at the bottom. I could hear it now, sobbing, screaming, muttering words I couldn't understand. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. No response, only the echoes. I forced myself to descend, inch by inch, the rope straining with my weight. The air grew colder, damp pressing against my face, and the scent of rust and earth intensified. My flashlight revealed the edges of bones and fragments of clothing scattered along the floor. I stumbled over something soft, sticky, and recoiled as I realized it was a patch of old, dried blood. The noises beneath me surged suddenly, like the bunker had exhaled. My fingers clenched the rope, heart pounding so violently I feared it might burst. And then I saw them. Faces pressed into the walls as if trying to escape, mouths open in silent screams. Hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me, their presence more felt than seen. I reeled back, losing my balance, flashlight swinging wildly. The whispering became a chorus. Pleading, angry, warning. I could no longer rationalize. Something had lived here, something that had been trapped, silenced, yet somehow conscious of my intrusion. I scrambled back up the rope, my breaths shallow and frantic. My hands were raw, my legs shaking, but I made it to the surface. Sunlight, or what passed for it through the dense canopy, felt alien, weak, and almost wrong. My van, once a sanctuary, now seemed vulnerable, exposed to the forest's watchful eye. That's when I heard it, a scream. Human. Screaming in real, immediate terror. Only it wasn't coming from the bunker. It was beneath the earth, moving, following. Mara appeared suddenly, stepping from behind a tree with the calm certainty of someone who had seen too much. "You shouldn't be here," she said, voice low but unwavering. I opened my mouth, but no words came. The air seemed heavier, the shadows moving in ways that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "It watches," she continued. "It doesn't forgive curiosity. What is it?" I managed to choke out. She shook her head. "The bunker holds more than history. It holds them, those who disappeared, those who should have never been here. And now, you're part of it." A rustling behind us made me spin, crowbar raised, eyes straining in the dim light. A figure emerged, not quite human, not quite beast. Limbs bent at wrong angles, skin pale and mottled, eyes black voids that reflected nothing. It moved silently, deliberately, closer with each heartbeat. My instinct screamed to run, but Mara placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Not yet," she said. "We survive by understanding, not fighting." I wanted to argue, to scream, but the presence of her calm grounded me, if only slightly. She led me back to the van, the creature following, sometimes appearing at the edge of the trees, sometimes closer, always watching. We sat in silence, listening as the ground beneath the campsite whispered and groaned, as if the earth itself mourned and waited. Mara spoke finally, recounting stories I had read online but never fully believed. Families disappearing during camping trips, hikers vanishing without trace, the bunker swallowing everything, but her voice carried weight, experience. She had survived somehow, because she respected the patterns, the rhythms, the limits of what the forest allowed. Night fell again. I realized that the campsite, the bunker, the forest itself were all one organism, conscious in a way that defied explanation. The creature, or creatures, were extensions of it, enforcers of boundaries I had foolishly ignored. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant, distorted scream drove adrenaline through me. My hands were raw from gripping the steering wheel, eyes bloodshot from staring into the darkness beyond the windshield. I thought of leaving, running to the nearest highway, but Mara shook her head. "Not until you understand," she whispered. The understanding came slowly, painfully. I noticed the small cues. The scratching preceded activity. The murmurs signaled attention. The shadows indicated movement long before my eyes could detect it. I learned to wait, to move only when the forest permitted, to acknowledge its rhythms. Mara guided me, teaching without words, a hand on my shoulder, a glance to the corner of my vision. By the third night, I could predict the patterns, anticipate the movements, and survive the screams beneath the campsite. By dawn on the fourth day, I felt a strange communion with the place. Fear had become a companion, tight in my chest, but manageable. The bunker, the forest, the shadows, they were no longer alien, only dangerous in their honesty. I realized that every tale I had dismissed online, every warning ignored, was true in its essence. Ashwood Bunker demanded respect, demanded awareness, and demanded acknowledgement of the unseen forces it sheltered. Mara was gone by morning. I found a note, small and almost imperceptible, tucked beneath my windshield wiper. You have learned. Do not forget. They are patient. My pulse raced even as relief settled over me. I packed my van with trembling hands, each movement deliberate, aware of every sound. The forest seemed calmer as I drove away, the shadows receding, the whispers fading to memory. And yet, the scratching lingered in my mind, a subtle reminder that the earth beneath Ashwood Bunker was alive and patient, waiting for the next intrusion. As the miles stretched between me and the campground, I thought of the lessons burned into me. Curiosity can be dangerous, fear can be a guide, and survival often depends on understanding rather than confrontation. My Volkswagen rattled over the gravel road, the engine hum a fragile comfort against the memory of hollow faces, whispering walls, and the unseen beneath the earth. I vowed never to return, and yet a part of me ached with the strange pull of that cursed place, the siren song of a forest that remembers everything. Even now, months later, I dream of it. The scratching returns at the edge of sleep, soft, insistent, reminding me of the boundaries I once crossed. The air in my bedroom tastes faintly of damp earth, and in those moments I feel the pull of the bunker, the forest, the unseen. And I remember Mara's words. They are patient. They say the Weminuche wilderness doesn't take people. It waits for them to offer themselves. I didn't believe that when I first heard it. I thought it was just one of those Colorado backcountry sayings passed around to spook newcomers, the kind of thing you hear from an old-timer leaning on a gas pump at a lonely station off Highway 160. But the night I realized how many names go missing in that part of the Rockies, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. The wilderness has its own memory, and sometimes it remembers you before you even know your own story. My name's Aaron. I'm 43 now, but this happened back when I was 36, still trying to shake off the last of my impulsive 30s. I'd spent a decade RV camping around the country, looking for stories. Not ghost stories, not legends, just the kind of quiet moments that happen when you're alone under the dark, cold stretch of a western sky. Colorado always felt different, bigger, older, like the mountains carried their age in their bones rather than their height. The Weminuche was the crown jewel of all of it, nearly 500,000 acres of raw, high-altitude silence. I'd been camping alone for years, but this trip didn't start alone. It began with a conversation at a campground outside Pagosa Springs, the kind of place where RVers stop for showers and hookups before disappearing into the woods for a week. There was a couple parked beside me, mid-50s, kind faces, soft voices like they were afraid to disturb the trees around us. They struck up a conversation while we were filling water. The wife, her name was Linda, said something I didn't think much of at the time. She said, "My sister's son went missing up there, right there, in the Weminuche. No trace, and they never found even his pack." I remember nodding politely, trying to show sympathy without inviting myself into their trauma. But then she added something else, something quieter, almost whispered, something that shouldn't have bothered me as much as it did. She said, "He told us the woods were calling his name the night before he disappeared. He thought it was a joke, or maybe echo off a canyon wall. But the voice knew things about him no echo should know." Then she'd apologized, said she shouldn't burden strangers with family tragedy. Her husband thanked me for listening, and by morning they'd moved on, headed somewhere safer, somewhere flatter, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of missing people in the wind. I should have left it at that. I should have driven somewhere easier, but like maybe a national forest with marked sites and cell signal. But the way she told that story stayed with me all morning, like the words were soaked in something heavier than grief. It felt like a warning, even though she didn't intend it as one. And maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe to the mountains, or maybe I just didn't want to feel like a coward for avoiding a place because of a story told in an apologetic whisper. So I drove deeper into the Wemanoosh. The first hours were beautiful in that way high wilderness always is. Thin air, bright sun burning through the pines, the kind of quiet that pushes the mind inward. I found a dispersed site along a narrow dirt road that wound around a ridge overlooking a valley so deep and shadowed it looked like it belonged to a different century. I parked my RV, leveled it out, and stepped outside to let the stillness settle into my bones. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt eerie. No voices in the trees, no strange tracks, just the kind of silence people come here for. It wasn't until the second night that the unease started. The day had ended in one of those huge, slow sunsets that paint the sky orange-pink, leaving shadows long enough to look like moving creatures. I cooked dinner, cleaned up, and sat outside listening to the last of the wind die off. Around 10, the temperature dropped hard the way it does at altitude. I went inside, shut the RV door, and turned off the lights. That's when I heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, not anything that could be explained by wind or wildlife. It was a single knock, soft, deliberate, on the RV's rear wall. At first, I froze, not scared, just unsure. Then, slowly, I walked to the back and pressed my ear to the metal. Nothing. I waited. Still nothing. My heart beat hard. Not because I believed in supernatural things, but because you never want a stranger knocking on your RV in the middle of the night. You never want anything human or animal close enough to touch the walls when you're 30 miles from the nearest paved road. I convinced myself it might have been thermal contraction, the RV cooling and popping. So I returned to my bed, got under the blankets, and tried to fall asleep. But the knock came again. This time, slightly louder. Same place, same rhythm. 3 soft taps, and that was the moment the quiet unease settled in. Not terror, not dread, just the sense that something was wrong in a way I couldn't yet articulate. I debated turning on the exterior lights, debated stepping outside with a flashlight the way I always did when something spooked me. But something held me back. Not fear. Instinct. A primal, bone-deep instinct that told me I didn't want to see whatever was making that noise. So I stayed still. And after a few minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the RV, every soft groan of metal expanding, felt like footsteps. Every brush of wind on the forest canopy sounded like someone dragging their fingers along the window. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing more than wildlife. Maybe a deer had rubbed against the wall. Maybe something had brushed the bumper. There was no damage, no prints, no sign of anything. I ate breakfast, stepped outside, and took in the view. The valley below was coated in low-moving fog, thick enough to look like it was breathing. I told myself it was normal, all of it. Morning fog, strange night sounds, high-elevation anxiety. People get spooked in beautiful places all the time. Around noon, I hiked down to a small creek not far from camp. The trail wasn't marked, but it wasn't difficult either. Just a worn footpath cutting through pines, the kind of path built by animals or other campers, not by rangers. I walked for maybe 20 minutes before reaching the water. That's where I saw the first sign that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't the creek, it wasn't the trees, it wasn't the silence. It was a backpack, not torn, not weathered, just sitting on a rock beside the water like someone placed it there minutes earlier and stepped away. The fabric was faded, but not old. And on one of the straps was a stitched name I didn't recognize immediately, but I recognized the last name. It was the same as Linda's. Her nephew, the missing camper, the one who heard the woods calling his name. I stood there staring at it, the cold air tightening around my chest like a fist, my breath fogging out in quick, short bursts. And in that moment, the first thread of tension pulled tight inside me. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt behind me, as if the forest had shifted, as if something had been waiting for me to notice. And I swear, though I knew it made no sense, I felt like the trees around me leaned in closer. I didn't turn around right away. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid I'd see someone standing there. Maybe I was more afraid I wouldn't. That moment, hovering between danger and the unknown, was the first time I felt something heavier than tension sink into my gut. Suspicion. A creeping, quiet suspicion that the story Linda told me wasn't a sad memory. It was a warning disguised as a conversation at a campground water spigot. I finally made myself turn, slow and cautious, feeling the cold air gather at the back of my neck. Nothing moved behind me. Nothing stood in the trees. But the silence had changed. It felt pressed in, like thick cloth wrapped around my ears. No birds, no creek babble, no wind, just the faint creaking of the forest, pine trunks shifting and adjusting like old bones. I stepped toward the backpack, the hairs on my arms bristling beneath my jacket. It wasn't dusty, it wasn't sun-bleached. The straps were stiff but not brittle. I unzipped it just enough to see inside. An empty water bladder, a pair of wool socks, a laminated trail map with one corner torn. The map wasn't for this trail. It belonged to a route miles deeper into the wilderness. And then I did something stupid, something driven by denial more than logic. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out here?" My voice bounced once off the trees and died instantly. No echo, just swallowed as if the forest didn't want to give it back. That alone should have made me leave, grab my pack, hike back to the RV, and drive out before the sun dipped. But something in me was still clinging to rationality, still insisting this was explainable. Someone left it here. Someone forgot it. Someone set it down and planned to return. People leave gear all the time. There's 100 normal reasons for a backpack in the woods. But there was one reason that wasn't normal, and it clung to my mind even as I walked back to camp, with stiff steps and tightening breath. Missing people don't leave their packs like that. They disappear with them. The fog had risen higher along the ridge when I got back, climbing up the slopes like slow, pale fingers. The sunlight looked thinner than it should have been, as if the air itself was filtering it out. I made lunch, forced myself to eat, tried to shake the dread that kept crawling under my skin like an uncomfortable truth I wasn't ready to admit. But the afternoon didn't get easier. It got stranger. Around 4, the knocking returned. But this time it wasn't on the RV. It came from the trees. A rhythmic tapping, soft but pointed, traveling from one trunk to another like someone walking a circle around the clearing and running their knuckles along bark as they went. Tap, 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 tap. I stepped outside with a flashlight, even though it was still daylight. I didn't see anyone, didn't see movement, but the sound kept shifting places, moving through the woods like something testing boundaries, never close enough to see, never distant enough to ignore. And then it stopped. I stood there in the stillness, breathing hard, palms sweating. Every instinct was telling me to pack up and leave, but the same stubbornness that brought me here, the same denial, whispered that leaving now would be giving in to fear, that I was letting my brain play tricks on me, that everything that happened could still be rational. I told myself I'd stay one more night. One. I'd see if things calmed down, give myself the chance to prove I wasn't losing it. That was the last safe decision I made. Night came earlier than it should have. The fog thickened, crawling across the forest floor until it touched the RV steps. The temperature dropped fast, and when I opened the door to grab firewood, a wave of air hit me that smelled wrong. Not rotten, not sulfurous, just wrong. Metallic, cold, like the inside of a cave that hasn't seen daylight in 1,000 years. I built a fire anyway, trying to shake the feeling. The flames flared orange, then dimmed, then flared again, like something in the air was interfering with the burn. I sat close, staring into the trees while the fire crackled with strange, irregular pops. That was when I heard it. My name. Clear. Soft. Impossible. Aaron. It didn't come from behind me, or from the trees, or from the ridge. It came from everywhere at once, carried in the fog like breath, exhaled inches from my ear. I jerked to my feet so fast the chair fell over behind me. I grabbed my headlamp, sweeping the beam around in frantic arcs. My pulse hammered, my breath turned sharp and uneven. I backed toward the RV but forced myself not to run. The voice came again. Aaron, help me. This time I recognized the voice. It was Linda's nephew, the boy who disappeared. The boy who heard voices the night before he vanished. Except this voice wasn't calling from pain. It wasn't pleading. It was luring, gentle, soft, familiar in a way that forced me to question whether memory or something else was shaping the sound. I shook my head hard, as if physically trying to dislodge the tricks the forest was playing. My chest tightened, my mouth dried, and I realized I was entering dread. Real dread. The kind that claws its way through everything you think you know and replaces it with instinctual truth. Something out there knew my name, and it wanted me to answer. I grabbed my keys, shoved them in my pocket, and backed up toward the RV door. But before I could reach it, the tapping began again, this time from directly behind me. Tap, tap, tap. I spun so fast I nearly slipped on the damp ground. My headlamp beam cut through the fog in a narrow cone, and for a split second I thought I saw a silhouette, a shoulder, a partial face, something angled and still. But the fog absorbed the shape before I could focus. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath shaking out in bursts. I leapt into the RV, slammed the door, locked it, then dropped all the curtains. I stood there shaking, trying to steady myself against the counter. Don't answer it, don't listen, don't go outside. I repeated those three thoughts like a mantra while pacing the length of the RV. Eventually, I forced myself to sit on the edge of the bed, back pressed to the wall, listening to the fire pop outside. And then everything went quiet. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe minutes, maybe an hour. But the moment the tapping stopped, something else replaced it. Footsteps. Slow, soft, moving around the RV. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Every step matched my breathing until my chest felt like it was compressing around my lungs. I covered my mouth with my hand to keep from making a sound. Something brushed the side of the RV, light, almost affectionate, like a palm dragging along metal. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my window, and I heard my name again. Aaron. Open the door. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every second felt stretched so thin it threatened to snap. I waited for sunrise like it was salvation. But when dawn finally came, the light didn't bring relief. Because when I stepped outside, the fog was thicker than it had been all night. And someone had placed the missing nephew's backpack on top of my fire pit. Perfectly centered, perfectly clean. As if it had never left my campsite at all. I stood frozen in the doorway of my RV, staring at the backpack sitting perfectly centered on the fire pit stones. It looked deliberate, arranged, like someone had placed it as a message or an offering or a threat. But as the fog clung thick around my ankles and crept up my legs, another thought hit me harder than the fear already tightening in my ribs. I hadn't brought the pack back from the creek. I left it exactly where I found it, so either someone had followed me or someone had been there long before I noticed. I stepped down slowly, scanning the clearing for footprints, but the ground was too dense with pine needles to show anything. My breath clouded in front of me, slow and heavy. The fog brightened and dimmed with the changing light in the sky, but it didn't lift. Instead, it pooled around my RV like it had settled for a purpose. I didn't want to touch the backpack, but I couldn't leave it sitting there either. So I picked it up with stiff fingers, careful as if it were a venomous animal, and placed it at the base of a pine tree. The moment I stepped back, the forest answered with something I still struggled to put into words, a shift, a tilt, as though the air itself inhaled. And then I heard it. Not my name. Not anymore. This time it was a whisper shaped like a smile. Finally, the word didn't echo. It wasn't loud, but it came from everywhere and nowhere, threading through the fog like someone leaning close enough to brush the back of my ear. I stumbled backward toward the RV, hand on the door handle before I even realized I'd moved. I had one instinct left, one honest, raw instinct amid the panic rising like wildfire in my throat. Get out. Drive. Don't look back. I threw everything inside the RV haphazardly. Stove, water, clothes, anything loose. The knocking didn't start again. The footsteps didn't return. The forest was silent except for my frantic packing, as if whatever was out there was waiting, patient and confident, like it knew something I didn't. When I turned the key in the ignition, the engine hesitated for a half second longer than it should have, long enough for cold to trickle down my spine, long enough for part of me to wonder if the forest was going to keep me the way it had kept the others. But then the engine caught. I slammed the RV into drive, and the wheels crawled forward, crunching over gravel and pine roots. The fog was so thick I could barely see the road, a narrow, uneven strip of earth winding between trees crowded too close together. The moment I cleared the campsite, something happened that nearly made me slam the brakes. A shadow moved to my left, not fast, not animal-like. It moved with intention. A shape as tall as a man, but too narrow, too elongated, like a person stretched and smoothed by static. Every instinct inside me screamed to look away, but curiosity dragged my head toward the window, just enough to see it step behind a tree and vanish like smoke sucked into a vent. I pressed the gas pedal harder. The RV groaned uphill, suspension rattling against the old forest road. Branches scraped the sides, some snapping against the windows with sharp cracks that sounded too much like fingers tapping to be easy to ignore. My hands shook on the wheel. My breath came in ragged pulls. All I wanted was sunlight, cell signal, other people, an ordinary world where trees were just trees again. But the forest wasn't done with me. Halfway up the ridge, I slowed for a bend, a tight curve where the ground dipped sharply into a ravine. The fog thinned just enough for me to see the slope, and that's where I saw the second backpack, then the third, then the fourth, lined along the base of the ravine like markers, some torn, some sun-bleached, some new. One of them looked like it belonged to a child. My throat clenched shut, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. A pressure spread through my chest, a crushing weight of horror, of grief, of realization. These weren't lost hikers. They had been taken. My foot slammed the accelerator so hard, the tires kicked rocks back into the fog. I didn't look again. I didn't slow. Every second felt like something was behind me, matching my speed, waiting for the moment I faltered. When the road finally widened and I saw the break in the trees ahead, the faint shimmer of sunlit air, I nearly cried. I tore through the last stretch of forest and burst into blinding light that dissolved the fog instantly, like stepping from one world into another. But even then, I didn't stop. Not until I reached a main road. Not until I had full bars of cell service. Not until the forest was a distant blur in my rear mirror. I pulled over at a turnout overlooking the valley. Cars passed occasionally. Voices drifted from hikers unloading gear a few hundred feet away. The normalcy of it felt unreal, like waking from a dream that still held one hand around your throat. I stepped out of the RV, hands shaking, lungs burning from holding terror inside for too long. The sun felt too warm, the world too bright. I tried to steady myself on the metal doorframe and look back the way I came. The line of forest along the ridge was still swaddled in thin fog, just barely, almost like it was watching. The backpack, I realized with a sick twist in my stomach, I had left it at the campsite. I couldn't go back for it. I wouldn't. Whatever I left behind wasn't mine to retrieve. Whatever had placed it on my fire pit wasn't finished with it. I drove straight to the ranger station near Vallecito. I told them everything except the voice, except the shape, except the feeling that something had followed me out. I told them I found a backpack, that I heard knocking around my campsite, that footsteps circled my RV in the middle of the night, that I felt unsafe. The ranger, a woman in her late 40s with deep-set eyes that looked like they'd seen more than any of us should, listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't give me the reaction I expected. Not disbelief, not alarm, something else, recognition. She told me quietly, "We get reports like that every few years. Not often, but enough." Then she leaned closer, "But we never find anything when we go in after. Never tracks, never gear, never campers. Just the feeling that we're being watched." That final word stuck to me all the way back to town. Watched. Like something in the Weminuche wilderness waited for people to enter its boundaries, waited for the ones who ignored warnings, questioned their fear, rationalized the strange until it was too late. Like something old, something rooted deep, something patient. I've camped all over the country since then, through storms and deserts and forests that tested me in ways I didn't know were possible. But I don't go back to the Weminuche. I don't drive anywhere near it. I don't even say its name unless I have to. And sometimes late at night, when the wind brushes the side of my RV the way it did that night, I feel that same cold breath on the back of my neck, that same whisper threading through the dark. Finally, like the wilderness is reminding me that I left before it was ready, like it's waiting for me to offer myself again.